History as it happens, May 24th, 2022. America's first replacement theorists.
Suspect was motivated by something called replacement theory, which is the totally false,
as radicalized, angry, alienated, lost, and isolated individuals into falsely believing that they will be replaced, that's the word, replaced, by the other.
The Democratic Party has decided that rather than convince you, people who are born here, that their policies are helping you and making the country better and stronger, they will change the electorate.
Before the Civil War, a Nativist movement achieved meteoric political success. The Know-Nothings started as a secret society in the 1850s, obsessed with halting Catholic migration. Soon, Congress had more than 100 Know-Nothing members. But as quickly as they rose, the Know-Nothings were gone. Their core idea that America must be saved from outsiders is still around and tearing at the fabric of national life. That's next as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Because ultimately, replacement theory is an extreme form of nationalism. It's an extreme form that has racial and ethnic prejudices at its very heart.
I can't say I know all that much about replacement theory, other than what I've been reading in the papers lately. The idea has been around for a long time, and not just in the United States. The current iteration, brought to light once more by the massacre at a grocery store in upstate New York, is a lunatic fringe idea that's gone mainstream in the age of Trump. It's often directed at immigrants from Central and South America. Fox News host Tucker Carlson's mentioned it hundreds of times on his evening program. In his view, the Democratic Party wants to grant amnesty to millions of illegal immigrants so they can vote, and in the process, disempower American citizens whose roots go back generations.
People who have lived here all of their lives, paid taxes, followed the rules, been good citizens, would find their votes diluted to the point of irrelevance.
Now, Carlson's critics say he is legitimating hatred of immigrants and providing a megaphone to ideas trafficked by white supremacists. President Biden made that much clear without naming Carlson in his remarks after the shooting spree by a young man who left a 180-page manifesto espousing all kinds of racist tropes.
The hate that through the media and politics, the internet, has radicalized, angry, alienated, lost, and isolated individuals into falsely believing that they will be replaced, that's the word, replaced, by the other, by people who don't look like them, and who are, therefore, in a perverse ideology that they possess and being fed lesser beings. I and all of you reject the lie. I call on all Americans to reject the lie.
So replacement theory isn't so much a theory as it is a conspiratorial lie, a form of paranoia. Fear and suspicion of immigrants, of the demographic and cultural changes their arrival portends, go back a long way in American history. The common name for it is nativism. Whatever you want to call it, these ideas, whether from the 19th century or our own time, share a fundamental premise: that America must be kept pure for the real Americans, the people born here. In the 1850s, those real Americans were Protestants, and the newcomers were Catholic, and the name of the movement that sought to keep Catholics out of the United States was the Know-Nothings. Christopher Phillips teaches history at the University of Cincinnati. His most recent book is The Rivers Ran Backward, the Civil War and the Remaking of the American Middle Border. He's a specialist in mid-19th century American history. Chris Phillips, welcome.
Glad to be here.
So we know that nativism, suspicion of foreigners, has a long history inside the United States. You might say the early Federalists subscribed to a brand of nativism with the Alien and Sedition Act. But when was the first nativist movement? Not just an attitude about immigrants, but an actual political movement.
Yeah, and of course, in that question, the operative term is movement. And without doubt, the first movement, nativist movement in American history, were the Know-Nothings in the 1850s, beginning kind of a little before that and peaking at the very tail end of the 1850s. That's the first movement in American history.
It was a short-lived movement, and movements often arise in reaction to something. the flood of immigrants, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, in the 1840s, but really the 1850s. I pulled from my shelf Sean Willentz's The Rise of American Democracy. He wrote, the sudden revival of nativism in the 1850s had political as well as social origins. The new immigrant wave reached its peak between 1850 and 55 at a level 5 times greater than a decade earlier. Who were these immigrants? Where were they coming from?
Well, first of all, just to give you an exact figure, between 1845 and 1854, coinciding with the period that you just mentioned, about 3 million immigrants poured into the country. And that is about, that's over 10% of the entirety of the nation at that point. So we are talking about big numbers. We're also talking about, in many ways, immigrants that were unlike previous immigrants. There were several major immigration waves in American history, the first one being kind of the British that occurred in the 17th and the 18th centuries. And then there was another one shortly after that, the Irish and the Germans that came in the late 18th and early 19th century. But this particular peak of that wave, that latter wave, focused in particular on the Irish, especially the Irish Catholics. And so in order to really understand all of this, you have to meld the ethnicity and the religion of this particular wave of immigrants to America.
And it was the fact they were Catholic that inspired the Know-Nothings at first, right?
Absolutely, without a doubt. Catholics, by the way, it's not just about the religion, because the Protestant Catholic conflicts that we know so well in our history certainly peaked for the first time at that moment, but they've been very old ones. It had something to do in many ways with the original migrations to America. But in this case, we have added impetus of a fear on the part of a number of urban Americans in particular, especially those on the East Coast where the migrations came, that there was going to be something of a replacement, a cultural replacement. There was going to be a religious replacement. These Catholics had very different foreign ways, and many of these Protestants who felt that they were being replaced or would be, felt that they really weren't Americans, and they didn't bow to the kind of the American power structure or cultural structure, that they took their cues from a distant leader, and that leader was in Rome.
There were really no immigration laws at this time stopping people from coming to the United States, right?
Not particularly. There was a law that was passed, interestingly enough, regarding immigration by the very first Congress under the very first president, George Washington. It didn't stop as much as it regulated, it directed, so to speak. But coming from that, not surprisingly, we have our first real crisis in American history late in the 1790s regarding foreigners, and it had to do with an international war that we were engaged in, and a response, as you mentioned at the start of the broadcast, by the Federalists, and in particular the Federalist president, John Adams, to try and squelch these aliens, so to speak, who were seen as being seditionists, people who were not Americanized, people who didn't have loyalties, didn't speak languages. So we already see the precursors of that even before we get out of the very first decade of American history. American meaning United States history.
Post-Constitution, our second Constitution after the Articles of Confederation. So in the 1850s, immigration was a real thing, but the Know-Nothings did subscribe to some conspiratorial thinking, to one of your earlier points about a distant leader, the Pope. And there was always a fear of papism or popery in the American mind.
I've got a great quote and it's an ironic one, by George William Curtis, who was a political theorist in the 19th century. This is the part of the quote that I'm really taken by because it seems to contrast very much with nativist ideas. Here's the quote: American civilization and America in general is a permanent protest against absolutism. And that is precisely what Protestants believed about Catholics. They were absolutists on every issue, whether it be the rituals in their church, whether it be the ideas of things like abortion and other things that we are still fighting about, and where loyalty should lie. And loyalty in the minds of these Protestants, American Protestants at the time, the loyalties of these Catholics lay in Rome with the Pope. And popery then wasn't seen as an anti-democratic and anti-American introduction, I guess you could say, into the American milieu. And therefore, it needed to be resisted. It needed to be stopped.
And the Pope at the time, I think his It was Pope Pius IX. He was a reactionary dude.
I'm going to have to, I was raised Catholic, but I'm afraid I've forgotten most of my catechism. Martin, I'm going to defer to you on that one.
Well, I know he opposed the liberal revolutions of 1848, and I'll just leave it there. If the Know-Nothings were the replacement theorists of their day, and we do have to be careful taking a modern term and placing it on people living in the 19th century, to one of your earlier answers, they also feared that the immigrant wave was replacing this past way of life, in a sense. They had this nostalgic sense of what life was like, working life was like in the cities prior to these swarms of immigrants who came to be identified or synonymous with high crime levels, crowded slums, etc.
It's really important to remember the Know-Nothing movement, and makes it different somewhat than our modern iteration of nativism that we're engaging in right now, was predominantly an urban movement. And that would make sense if you think about the fact that the largest portion of these Catholic Irish immigrants came and stayed in cities, and in particular, eastern cities, where the large cities in America were, with the exception perhaps of New Orleans, but Know-Nothingism finds its strength in New Orleans as well. So it's the urban centers that see this response, this nativist response.
So where did the Know-Nothings get their name?
Well, it was kind of a secret club, a little bit. It was a secret society, and those were very common in the 19th century, common in the sense that in a democratic milieu, and this would make perfect sense thinking about this in the broader stretch of American history, in a democratic society, the ideas are generally associated with merit, and that anyone who can and does then deserves what they earn. And in this case, we've got the flip side of that coin. We've got the overriding fear, as Satchel Paige, the pitcher, once said, not to look over your shoulder because somebody's gaining on you. And in a democratic milieu, if you aren't succeeding, then there must be someone who's taking your success away from you. And in the case of immigrants, in this way, the Know-Nothings capitalize on that fear, on that democratic fear that these people are coming in and they are intent upon, again, using the current euphemism, replacing all of these other hardworking democratic sorts with new thinking, new languages, with new cultures, and with new successes. The irony, of course, is that over the course of American history, most waves of immigration start out at the bottom. They don't come in and sort of immediately and place themselves at the top. And so it's important to remember that nativism is often associated with class, not perfectly, but it's often there. And so it's the class elements of the lower part of the social spectrum that engage most heatedly in these kinds of struggles and these conflicts.
And the Know-Nothings grew out of a couple of different organizations. There was the Order of United Americans and also the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. And when they started to hold meetings and started to organize, the members were instructed, when asked about what they were up to say, "I know nothing." It was not a commentary on their intelligence.
Right. And also their secrecy, they felt served them well, because in this political vacuum at the moment, in which we see kind of the decline and ultimately the death of one of the major two parties, the Whigs in particular, and then the faltering or the struggles of the Democratic Party at that particular moment in the 1850s, we see these know-nothings rising up into that vacuum before the Republicans emerge as an organized party. They have that moment and they feel that secrecy helps them. And so the idea of "I know nothing," they kind of use that as a weapon, but also partly as a defense, so that the less that people know about them, the more their impact will occur when ultimately it does.
The Know-Nothings were nativists, but they weren't necessarily racists. I mean, many of them opposed slavery, maybe not for moral reasons, but...
Yeah, I guess it all depends upon how we define race. When we're talking about ethnicity, as we understand it, the Catholics were seen in many ways in a very racialized way. And the terms that are so often used in racial discourse about lower orders and unintelligent and dirty and, all of this ugly racist language that we've become so familiar with. All of that was in place with the Catholics, particularly with the Irish, and also the exclusion rather than the inclusion of these immigrants was often accomplished through racialized means. They were segregated. They were excluded. No Irish allowed was a very real thing in many of these cities. It doesn't take long when you talk with anyone today of Irish extract about their own history that these terms come forward freely, that their ancestors too, regardless of the color of their skin, were treated in a racialized manner by Protestant, or if you will, WASP Americans.
And one of the fears was these Catholic immigrants would be having too many children, and they would eventually outnumber the good Protestant American stock up in New England.
Absolutely right. And there were all a host of other stereotypes, that came with them. And ultimately, when the know-nothings have their moment, when they gain control of a number of state legislatures, and what follows in some sense are laws that will, in many ways, fulfill those stereotypical ideas about the Irish, such things as the deportation of foreign beggars and criminals, however defined, right?
And drinking as well.
And drinking as well. And we have to understand that we can talk all we want about nativism at this particular moment, but without entwining nativism with the other two major political and ideological conflicts of the moment, temperance and anti-slavery, we can't really get a full understanding of just how expansive were these conflicts that the know-nothings were at the center of.
There was a temperance movement. There was too much drinking in the United States, but the Catholic immigrants, the Germans and the Irish, didn't want to go along with the temperance movement. They didn't want to go dry.
And when we're talking about drinking in the middle of the 19th century, the average consumption, man, woman, and child in the United States in 1850 of hard liquor, I'm not talking about beer and wine, I'm talking about distilled liquors, were 7 gallons a person a year.
Man.
7 gallons. They put liquor in milk for children. It helped them sleep. It also killed any potential bacteria that was in it. Working men would leave their jobs and they would head across to the saloon and they would spend their hard-earned wages there all night. Not surprisingly, women become pretty active temperance reformers in this period of time because they and their children were most affected by this.
Domestic violence.
Also affects the politics because, yes, the traditions of the Germans and the Irish were carried intact over across the ocean to the United States. And so, yes, they did resist temperance reform, and that then made them further targets of nativists.
So the know-nothings emerged pretty quickly. They soon have about 1 million members. Among their leaders were the elites in society, Millard Fillmore, who wasn't so much concerned with anti-Catholicism as he was with some other things, but he was one of the know-nothings leaders. I think he eventually ran for president under the know-nothing ticket. But who were their constituents? White working class or upper middle class people who were suspicious of the immigrants coming into the cities?
Absolutely right. Now, it's important to note that as far as the know-nothings go, all classes embrace the know-nothings politically to some degree. As with any movement, we've got leaders like Fillmore or others who capitalize politically on this movement when they sense that there's a political opportunity. But the shock troops were tradesmen, urban tradesmen in particular, and white WASP working class. So it's leaders below the political elite. Thomas Whitney, for example, was one of the leaders, the real leaders of the Know Nothing Party in New York. And he was a silversmith and a printer. So he's a person who kind of walks on both sides of that. He's skilled to a certain degree. He's a silversmith, but he's also a tradesman. And then, of course, down below that, you've got the famous, and anyone who's seen the Scorsese film Gangs of New York will know this character, William Poole, also known as Bill the Butcher. He was a butcher, but he was also a gang leader and a boxer and a pugilist. And he was the leader of, at the kind of the lowest level, these native or true Americans. And those are important terms because it separates them from these immigrant hordes that they opposed, particularly the Irish, the Native Americans, right?
Yeah.
We are native born, or if not native born, then we're first generation immigrant, as opposed to these second and third generation immigrants who we despise. They're unskilled, right? We've made something of ourselves. They become kind of the leaders at the local levels in these cities of this movement that was admittedly national, but predominantly local and urban.
But to become a national political force, even just a sectional political force, the Know-Nothings had to be interested in other things beside opposition to Catholic immigration. I should always make sure to say Catholic immigration. Just to quote Wilentz once more, beneath nativism's original nostalgic rhetoric lay undemocratic aspirations of a kind that had been in abeyance in northern politics since the advent of the New School Whigs in the later 1830s. So there was an anti-democratic strain, a disdain for party politics, the Democrats and the Whigs, which were viewed as patronage parties. The whole thing stinks, the whole system is rotting and corrupt. Echoes there of Trumpism in a way.
Oh, absolutely. This is, kind of the hallmark of conspiracy theorist politics. And the Know-Nothings played it well. For the Know-Nothings, ironically, they believed that their viability was best secured by staying out of these national debates, particularly about slavery, and focusing exclusively on immigration, and particularly the immigration that they opposed, Catholic immigration. They thought that that was a winning strategy in this moment when slavery was killing the Whig Party and it was dividing the Democratic Party into sectional wings. And ultimately, it will be their undoing, much like the Whigs themselves, because by not being able to articulate a national position on the issue of slavery, they really could not find the true widespread support that they needed to become a truly national party.
The slavery issue eventually partly undoes the Know-Nothings after their brief success. Before we get to that, I want to talk about the problems with the Whigs. Nativism split the Whigs, and the Know-Nothings capitalized on that. I mean, there were divisions in American politics at this time that made the emergence of a third party possible. Let's start with the Whigs and nativism.
Well, first of all, the Whigs were a party that had, in many ways, reached the near apex of political strength by being a party that supported balance of national and regional interests. They believed that the government is a force for good. They believed funding in particular would actually assist with kind of a national expansion. And so right from the start, these are nationalists, these Whigs. They're led by Henry Clay of Kentucky. They call themselves National Republicans. That's the real name for the Whig Party. And Henry Clay was a nationalist, a compromiser. His American system saw the federal treasury investing heavily in expansionist goals like roads and railroads and canals and dredging and national banks, right? They lay their claim to the American dream by way of embracing the idea of a central national government, and a fairly strong one. And they are resisted by the Democrats, a Democratic Party that in many ways associates itself with a different class of people, a more common man, so to speak, people who don't want the government to be big. They don't want a national bank. They don't think that anyone deserves a handout. They don't believe these immigrants in particular were going to be, in many ways, the engine behind the nation. They felt that they could be used politically, but they didn't necessarily embrace them.
Most conservative Whigs, though, subscribed to nativism, and many of these newcomers voted Democrat. I mean, the Irish became Democrats.
Yeah, right. And of course, the Democratic Party understood very, very well, particularly its urban dimension. They understood that these immigrants were central to their future in terms of voters. We'll really see this gaining strength after the Civil War, more than before, but part of the structure of the Democratic Party saw urban workers aligning with Southern planters and capitalizing in many ways on those immigrant voters who could be cajoled into voting the Democratic ticket because they were instructed that the Democratic Party believed that everybody should stand on their own 2 feet and that everyone had an equal chance. The irony, of course, in much of this is that the Democrats believe quite the opposite.
So the know-nothings attract nativists, they attract anti-establishment types, conservative Whigs, Northern Democrats who are opposed to slavery, temperance folks, and any political movement, for it to succeed, needs to gain political power. After the 1852 national elections is when the know-nothings rise to prominence. 1853, 1854, we're talking about state elections, congressional midterm elections. Quoting a Smithsonian Magazine article here, 100 elected congressmen, 8 governors, a controlling share of half a dozen state legislatures from Massachusetts to California, and thousands of local politicians. Basically, the entire state of Massachusetts went to the know-nothings. That's incredible for a third party to come on the scene and take over a state within a few years.
As far as Massachusetts goes, that's pretty easy. Boston. This is the epicenter of the Irish Catholic migration to America. We also need to remind ourselves that the Irish came to the United States incredibly destitute as a result of a famine, a potato famine that largely robbed them of the ability simply to provide food for themselves. And so they come in desperation. They don't have the resources, more than the resources simply to get to the United States, and they stop in the first cities that they arrive in, and Boston was one of those cities. And so that it changes literally overnight the cultural complexity of this old Puritan city, and it suddenly becomes a new Irish Catholic city. And so it's no surprise whatsoever that, given the fact that the nativists were largely an urban phenomena and that they were largely a phenomena that reacted to local conditions, it's no surprise that Massachusetts becomes in many ways the epicenter of the know-nothing successes.
Here's what the know-nothing supported. Again, citing the Smithsonian article, a 21-year naturalization period for immigrants. The deportation of foreign beggars and criminals. You mentioned that earlier in our chat. Mandatory Bible reading in schools. The elimination of all Catholics from public office. They also wanted to restore their vision of what America should look like, as the article says, with temperance, Protestantism, self-reliance, with American nationality and work ethic enshrined as the nation's highest values. I suppose all those immigrants weren't working hard enough for them, right? So
Right.
What undoes the know-nothings? Because they reach this peak of their power in the mid-1850s, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the elections of 1856 happen, and it seems that, in part, the dispute over slavery does to the know-nothings what it did to the Whigs.
All true. And then there's another part of this story that we haven't really discussed, and that is that the know-nothings really didn't find significant traction in the West. And the West was, of course, where the nation was moving and had already moved at this point in time. We don't have large cities yet in the West, and therefore it doesn't have the same kind of urgency, this idea of immigration. Second of all, many of those immigrants that were, particularly the Catholic immigrants that were central or in the bullseye, so to speak, of the know-nothings, they didn't go west in the numbers that an earlier or a different migration did, and those were the Germans. And these Germans were not predominantly Catholic. There were many of them who were, but there were many more who were not. And these Germans end up going to the West, and they create communities there that these know-nothings don't appeal to at all. And they are really important forces, political forces and cultural forces in so much of the West, in places urban and rural. In a largely rural region, the know-nothings just don't have that penetration that they get elsewhere. And when the know-nothings reach their peak, right about the time of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they don't really have an answer to it, because the Kansas-Nebraska Act is not about immigration. It's about slavery. And it's about the future of the nation without immigration at its center. Of course, that's ironic, because immigration is, in many ways, the scaffolding theme of U.S. history. But in the case of politics, they couldn't get the traction that they needed. And when the Republicans seize on that issue of slavery in the West, and it becomes the issue that draws many more Americans into its orbit than know-nothingism ever could.
And we did mention how know-nothingism took on other issues, not just opposition to Catholic immigration, but slavery came to dominate almost the entire political debate, if you will, in the United States by this period. Nativism would live on, of course, but slavery became the issue to define American politics. 1856 election. James Buchanan, the Democrat, wins. Buchanan wins with 45% of the popular vote. He carried 19 states. He's from Pennsylvania. He does carry his home state, but he carries the entire South and California. Fremont, the first Republican nominee ever for president, wins 11 states, but only 33% of the popular vote. Millard Fillmore wins 21% of the popular vote. 1 out of every 5 people votes for a know-nothing.
Almost exclusively in the Northeast. Kind of in a Madisonian view of things, no faction will rule in American history because they're so diffuse and they're so spread out. Well, here's a moment when know-nothingism could have aligned the nation differently, but it faltered because it could not appeal outside of one region of the country. Slavery, on the other hand, had a much broader appeal. And it will be no surprise that many of these former know-nothings will realize very quickly that the immigration or the nativist issue is far less potent than the slavery issue, and they will then align themselves differently. They will take on that Republican Party that begins in the West, in a place where know-nothingism doesn't really have that force, and then it will spread back to the East and overspread the former know-nothing area of the North.
Yeah, the anti-slavery know-nothings, their commitment to the cause was meh. I mean, they were not like the Republicans, and that's one reason why the know-nothings fall apart. Their anti-slavery members go join the Republicans, especially after the 1857 Dred Scott decision. So what is the know-nothings' lasting legacy? What mark did they leave on politics in this short time they were around?
That's a complicated question because the obvious answer is little to none. If one were simply going to go on their political successes and their rise and fall, they fell as fast as pretty much as every other populist movement in American history has, which, by the way, the rule of thumb is 2 election cycles for populist movements is the life and death. And in this case, that's precisely what happened with the know-nothings. But I'll offer something that actually isn't mine so much, written recently in the New York Times by columnist Bret Stephens, that the know-nothings were simply part of 4 broader replacement tropes or eras, if you will, phenomena in U.S. history. And there have been 6 of them. Native American replacement, which, by the way, was embraced by not regionally or sectionally, but by most white Americans of the time. It was probably the worst and the cruelest of all of them.
Well, I would agree that the only people who have a right to complain about being replaced, truly the only people, are Native Americans, because it happened to them.
Right, and it's been ongoing.
Yes.
Right, and then of course the second one was the Protestant Catholic issue, the replacement by these mass migration of Catholics. That's where the know-nothings intersected with. But then there was, a racial replacement, and that had to do with slavery, meaning that white workers who had come from parts of Britain, particularly the Irish and the Scots-Irish, had been largely replaced as laborers by Africans. And then, of course, the WASP replacement of the late 19th century, the ethnic replacement, where you've got Eastern Europeans who are poor and Catholic and Jewish and urban. They are now suddenly replacing former working class Protestant workers who had kind of had their moment as well. And then lastly, the last movement is the current one. And that is what I call the MAGA movement. White working class people are arguing in conspiratorial way, blaming the government for replacing them with a brown working class from Latin America, from Africa, or as the former president put it so delicately, S-hole countries. That is, I think, if you take it in the broad sense of these various replacement moments in American history, the know-nothing legacy is to frame those movements or frame the opposition to them in terms that are eerily familiar and persistent in American history.
Well, I was going to ask you, if we do have a nativist movement today, not just nativist attitudes, but you said, yeah, the MAGA movement is in part a nativist movement.
It was born of immigration. That was the consolidating issue to begin with.
Well, we all remember Donald Trump's initial comments when he became a candidate for president way back in 2015. Man, that seems like a long time ago, when he came down that escalator in Trump Tower in New York City and said that Mexico sends rapists and murderers and other undesirables. They send their worst people here.
They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Why don't we wrap up with this? Some commentators have pointed out that this current strain of replacement theory has a very dark, conspiratorial, violent way about it. Just look at this fellow up in Buffalo who shot all those people in a grocery store. He was clearly committed to murder.
Yeah, it gets so tangled because it was such a different motive in Buffalo than in some of these other incidents. This one was almost exclusively racial. But if one were to broaden out the general sense, the ideas behind someone like this particular individual, you hear all of its hallmarks in the arguments over nativism. Because ultimately, replacement theory is an extreme form of nationalism. It's an extreme form that has racial and ethnic prejudices at its very heart. The very notion that there are some true Americans and then there are non-native or non-true Americans, regardless of color. What has been kind of the more modern iteration of this, at least since middle of the 20th century, is that this is a brown migration or a brown immigration. And that has only heightened the racial aspects of this beyond the ethnic that have always been there.
Yeah.
Status anxiety is at the center, lies at the heart of replacement theory and nativism in every case.
Chris Phillips of the University of Cincinnati, we thank you for your insights. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the NATO question returns. Finland and Sweden say they are ready to join the alliance, but Turkey may object as Vladimir Putin looks on at a situation he hoped to avoid. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.